Right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning. We have some folks joining, so we will give it a few minutes to let everyone get in here, and then we'll kick it off. Coming in. We still have a few more folks coming in, so I'll give it another 30 seconds. Perfect. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our Income Lab webinar this morning. We have our panelists, Justin Fitzpatrick and Derek Tharp, here to lead this discussion on thinking and talking about retirement risk with clients. This is a topic that many of you have requested, so we're super excited to put this on for you all. And just some housekeeping items before I turn it over to our panelists. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And so you'll see in our Zoom space here, you'll see a Q&A button on your toolbar. Feel free to put your questions in there. You can also view other folks' questions and to move the questions up in the queue. And then after that, we'll just work through the questions for our panelists. And after the webinar, we will send the recording link out as well. So if you do want to go back and review, we'll get that sent out tomorrow. And for some of our folks here who are new to Income Lab, if you'd love to set up a demo or a meeting with our team after as well, you can reach out to us through our website or to info@incomelaboratory.com. And we're more than happy to set up a Zoom to show you the software and get you in there as well. Perfect. Well, all right, guys, that's my spiel. I will turn it over to Justin and Derek. Can you guys hear us okay?
Yep, sounds good.
Alrighty.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Happy January. We're having a snowstorm here in Golden, Colorado, so I don't know what it's like where you are, but yeah, this is a topic I'm really passionate about. And kind of like our last user webinar, there'll be some things here that are a little more for advisors thinking about risk and retirement, but we really want to focus on also ideas and concepts that you can use in talking with clients about retirement risk and rolling those concepts into your planning process and your monitoring and management process in that relationship with the clients. So I'm going to make sure this is, yep, okay. Okay, so a quick outline for the webinar today. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on kind of what retirement income and retirement income risk is really like. So we'll talk about metaphors. We'll talk about just some of these continuums of risk. Then we'll dive into what sorts of things actually lead to retirement income risk and what don't. So look at a bunch of data there. And then we'll wrap up talking about client communication and kind of ways to keep things at the right level. Okay, so first to kind of what retirement risk is like. I want to start by talking about metaphors because it's really common for us to speak in metaphors. I mean, really in all parts of our life, but when talking about retirement risk, we'll see this a fair amount. And I guess what I want to do is encourage everyone to take metaphors seriously because they convey a lot of information and they can actually convey the wrong information if we're not careful. So the metaphor of a plane crash is actually pretty common to see in discussions of retirement and retirement planning. So you might see something like, hey, why should I be okay with a 90% chance of success? Would you get on a plane that has a 10% chance of crashing, right? That, just at first blush sounds fine, right? Okay, it's 90-10, so just pick something and look at the failure of that thing. But the failure involved in a plane crash is very different than other kinds of failures, things like running into a traffic jam, a detour, a fender bender, and so on. It actually contains a lot of information. So if we use that sort of metaphor with clients, they're going to take a lot of information about what you're saying retirement is like from that. And probably not going to be a surprise that I'm going to argue that is not a good metaphor for retirement and retirement risk. However, even if you're not using that kind of metaphor, there's messaging everywhere if we're not careful. And in particular, common statistics and views that you may see, in the media or in research, in software programs, can communicate more than we'd hope. So, for example, sort of the grand champion of retirement income statistics is probability of success, or its inverse, probability of failure. So you might see something like the chart on the left. We're estimating you have a 90% chance of success, 10% chance of failure. Or you might see a spaghetti chart like on the right that's saying, hey, these are possible routes that your retirement portfolio could take over time. Notice some of them go to zero. Well, whether we like it or not, this actually communicates a lot of things, like retirees either succeed or fail, right? That's what the graph on the left encourages clients to think, right? Okay, there's going to be two possible outcomes, success or failure. This also implies that retirement risk is catastrophic because we're using this term failure. Or even the chart on the right, those lines going to zero, that sure seems catastrophic, or that the magnitude is very high, right? If risk materializes, we're looking at total loss, total financial ruin. And the chart on the right in particular, but both in a way, also imply that retirement is static, that you've got to make the perfect decision now, or else things could go terribly wrong. And I'll be arguing against all of these as actual characteristics of retirement. But before getting to that, I want to return to something I've talked about before, which is the way that we perceive risk as human beings. So this is, advisors, clients, everyone, is not just as kind of dispassionate statisticians. So Peter Sandman, who's an expert in risk communication, particularly in the industrial world, but I think it applies very well to financial planning as well, talks about risk and full, risk perception being a combination of what he calls hazard, which you could think of as the objective, that dispassionate statistical thing, and what he calls outrage, which is a little bit more of an emotional reaction. That doesn't mean it's not real, though. This is not something that we can get away from. And he sets up all these oppositions between more outrageous and less outrageous things that are perceived as riskier or less risky. And you'll notice all the characteristics I just argued are communicated with kind of standard status quo language or statistics are on the more outrageous side. So catastrophic, unresponsive or static, dreaded. So that would be, high magnitude of failure, total financial ruin. Those are all on the outrageous side here. So we could be heightening client perception of risk in using that kind of terminology and that kind of framing. Instead, retirement is actually, there's a lot of characteristics of retirement income, how it works, that really give advisors and clients a huge advantage over these more dire sorts of ways of painting things. So retirees don't either succeed or fail. In fact, the experiences they will have will be somewhere on a spectrum of possibilities. Some might be a little bit better, some might be a little bit worse. If managed well, at least historically, we know that does not include financial ruin. because really risk in retirement unfolds slowly. Retirement is a long-term thing. We'll dive into that a little bit soon. But because of that, we have the opportunity to adjust rather than have this sort of static Wile E. Coyote run off a cliff sort of behavior that's implied by, those spaghetti graphs. And in practice, at least in studies, magnitude of adjustment is often low for reasonable plans. So a way to kind of understand how retirement risk really works might be to compare it to a highly leveraged hedge fund, because those metaphors of things like a plane crash, it really feels like that's more like a highly leveraged hedge fund. People are thinking of examples, right? Whether it's long-term capital management or, pick your example of a hedge fund that goes down in flames. Maybe it was doing fine, but because liabilities there can be concentrated in time. So maybe, there's a derivative position and it's marked to market. Suddenly there's basically a margin call, hedge fund can't afford it, and it has to close, right? So it's sudden, huge liabilities that can't be undone once the risk has arisen, right? So we have the derivative position. I can't go back in time and undo that before the risk actually materializes. And so we do see, hedge funds go out of business. In comparison, retirement income is completely different. So liabilities here are spread out over time. So think about, your monthly utility bill, insurance bills, going to the grocery store. Even larger items are spread out over time. Maybe you're doing, some more expensive vacations or a home renovation, but those are often in the future or over time. Because of that, because it's this series of small liabilities that lay themselves out through time and often over many decades, risk also develops over time. And maybe most importantly, those liabilities are flexible. So unlike the case of a derivative position, mark-to-market, margin call type situation, you can change your plan for liabilities. So you can, the example I often use is you can go out for burgers instead of steaks. You can buy a cheaper bottle of wine. You can, shop at Safeway instead of Whole Foods. And that flexibility gives retirees an incredible amount of power. Of course, people would prefer to, meet all their dreams in terms of spending, but failure to hit every single one of them is not best compared to a plane crash. It's not a life or death situation. And again, for reasonable plans, for people who have reasonable range of behavior, financial ruin is not doesn't have to be a part of this picture. So what sorts of things can lead to retirement risk and what can't? Well, again, focusing on the catastrophic, when people think about risk, they often think about catastrophic things, right? They're the easiest ones to bring to mind. In fact, that's on Sandman's list. So things that are kind of, more easily visualizable are the risks that we think of. But it turns out for retirement, the most spectacular historical market crashes didn't have what it took to be retirement killers. So here we have 5 of the steepest, quickest market crashes in history. And what would have happened to a retirement portfolio if someone were taking $50,000 a year out of $1 million 60/40 portfolio, adjusting that for inflation over time? This is obviously a very simplistic example. Most people would have Social Security and lots of other things, but serving as an example, and you'll see that in no case did people run out of money because of this. And we're taking 5% here, right? This isn't the 4% rule. In every case, they would have ended up with this is inflation adjusted dollars, with close to what they began with or more by the end of retirement, or for those situations like the recent COVID crash a couple of years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago now, or the financial crisis. So far, things have not they haven't been retirement killers. Now, in particular for the COVID crash, that is very much a work in progress, but you'll see these folks are almost up at $1.2 million. For the financial crisis, it took quite a bit longer, but they are now about in the same position. Just dipping into client communication quickly, we often hear that clients are asking about kind of the more memorable, or maybe in this case, not memory, but the visualizable things in history, like the Great Depression. And it turns out if someone's asking, well, what if we go through the Great Depression, we can actually answer that question. We can illustrate what it would have been like to live through Great Depression type experiences. Of course, today's world is very different from the Great Depression. We have Social Security, we have, just a lot of different things going on. But if they were to experience the same sorts of sequence of returns, we can actually illustrate for them what that would be like. And so you'll see here, this is a graph from our software, but for these folks, their proposed income is, let's call it 16,000. You can see for most of the Great Depression, people actually could have afforded quite a bit more than that. Doesn't mean the future will be exactly the same as the Great Depression, but instead of allowing clients to kind of let their imaginations run wild about how horrible it might have been, we have data about how things behaved in the Great Depression. What about inflation? This is a particular headline type thing right now. Again, actually historical short inflation spikes, so we're talking 4 or fewer years, are not retirement killers. And in fact, the correlation between short-term inflation rates, so just year-over-year inflation, right? CPI today versus a year ago, and what you can do with your portfolio withdrawals is basically zero. So there's just no predictive power here. And in fact, it's easy to find examples historically of inflation spikes where the portfolio withdrawals that we know someone could have afforded now, with hindsight, were actually quite high compared to history. So the last time we saw such an inflation spike was in 1990, and that was among the highest, the best periods to retire in a sense in history. And so you see some other examples here from the 50s and 40s. That doesn't mean that there's no such thing as risk. But what we tend to need, going back to what is retirement risk like, what we tend to need is long-term, low real returns. So any way that you can, produce that situation will result in lower retirement income in comparison to other historical periods. So here I have the growth of $1 invested in the Dow in blue, using the right axis. You can see that, so it's a log scale. And then in the red and green, you have inflation and deflation. And there've really been 2 periods in the last 150 years that were worst for portfolio withdrawals. One was leading up to the 19-teens. I'll pretty much ignore that today. It's just people don't have, including myself, don't have as much kind of mastery of what was going on in those periods, but let's call it leading up to and including World War I. But maybe more closer in time certainly is the 60s and 70s, so the kind of stagflation period. And you can see here that the blue line is kind of going sideways, going up and down a little bit, but bouncing between values. And the red line was entering a period of higher inflation. And this combination is what gave us the period that Bill Bengen pointed out as having a 4% withdrawal rate in his study. What's interesting here, though, is what really matters is, I know this sounds obvious, but what matters is what's going to come in the future, not what we're experiencing today or what we have experienced in the past. So actually, the periods from the early and mid 60s, which in retrospect had low withdrawal rates, also had low inflation. It was that inflation was going to be high and high for longer periods. The other interesting thing is toward the end of, or really even in the middle of this high inflation period, we know in retrospect that portfolio withdrawals could have been quite high. It wouldn't have felt like that at the time, but because we were going to go into the 1980s with inflation going down and really amazing stock returns for quite a long period of time, again, it wouldn't have mattered what you had just experienced in a sense, or what you're experiencing at that point. What matters was what was going to come. A really important thing for planning, though, here is you wouldn't have felt good recommending high portfolio withdrawals at this point. And that's okay, because we can't know what's going to come in the future. The solution to that is not to make guesses, set those in stone, and just hope you're right. The solution is to have a plan to adjust over time. So maybe in 1982, which we know in retrospect was a time that would have supported incredibly high withdrawals, you wouldn't necessarily have counseled high withdrawals, but by keeping track of the plan, the world would have been telling you really year over year, maybe even month over month at times, hey, you can take more, you can spend more, you can increase your standard of living if you want to. So again, there's a lot of power in this adjustability. I was just talking earlier about how you can reduce liabilities. You can also loosen the belt, right? Maybe you've been being frugal, you've been, kind of keeping things in check because you're trying to manage risk. Well, again, there can be signals that risk is coming off as well. So that gets us to client communication. And I want to just spend a little time in wrapping up here before questions and Derek's comments on kind of two ways that we talk about risk in financial planning. One is what, I was talking about the metaphor of plane crashes and that sort of catastrophic framing and how that's not really accurate when compared to retirement income. But actually, when talking with clients about asset allocation and investing, already have a lot of tools for working in reasonable ways with uncertainty, for working in reasonable ways with risk. So when talking about asset allocation, I'm not sure I've ever heard a financial advisor focus only on the kind of the left tail outcomes. What are the worst possible things that could happen here? Instead, there's often a focus on averages and variances, right? Acknowledging that things could be a little better or worse, or maybe even a lot better or worse than the averages, and focusing more on risk management than total risk avoidance. Often that's because the alternative is not better, right? So putting money in the mattress, actually your long-term returns in inflation-adjusted terms could be quite bad. And so in some sense, it's instead of seeking perfection, which can't be found, we just manage risk. And there's also usually good discussion of the upside, right? Why are we doing this? What's the potential upside of investing for those where it's appropriate? What I'm talking about here is really applying those sorts of concepts to retirement income. It actually turns out historically, a 60-40 portfolio in inflation adjusted terms, there's a reasonably high chance of negative real returns over a 10-year period in just a balanced portfolio. Again, inflation adjusted returns. Famously, there aren't that many where you have negative nominal returns. But we don't go to clients and say, well, I think, there's a 10% chance we'll have no returns over the next 10 years. So that's what we should expect, right? That's not kind of the common way that we communicate with clients, and I think rightly so. So how can we do this? It's avoiding things like metaphors that are not accurate reflections of how retirement works, right? So talking about adjustments and laying out those expectations as much as possible early on. This is how risk unfolds in retirement, and really bringing the blood pressure down. Often by showing something like this, where we've actually quantified kind of an adjustment plan in dollar terms, that helps bring the blood pressure down, right? So we're not allowing clients to just kind of imagine risk, where our imaginations can go wild. But we're saying, and this is just an example, let's say someone had a plan where it was going to take a 20% loss in their portfolio for them to adjust downward. And if they adjusted downward, it wouldn't be a huge adjustment. That goes a long way to really specifying, to filling in the picture of risk for the client so that they can have a better understanding of the geography that they're really traveling through, right? So you're mapping this out for them in a way that they can understand how to follow the map. Also painting now that was more of a short-term picture, painting a broader picture of that geography, right? So here's the whole map. this is kind of our planned route, but if we encounter obstacles on the way, we will adjust, right? We just saw part of that adjustment plan. Well, what's the range of paths that we might take through this landscape? We can actually paint that for them, and again, hopefully bring the blood pressure down, by showing, hey, even if things, we talked about that continuum of possible experiences, even if things are on the lower end of that continuum, we're not talking about total financial ruin. Derek has talked about this before, and I think his research with Michael Kitsis on this is really illuminating, because don't just take my word for it. Survey research with clients has shown that this kind of framing, so getting away from the catastrophic framing, is associated with greater positive emotion, optimism, preparedness, confidence in a downturn, which is huge, and less negative emotion, less stress, greater understanding of the plan. I think is a big one, right? If we're using kind of overly complex statistics, not everyone necessarily would take the things we want to from those, and greater advisor trust, which what we found is retirement planning is really about being on a journey with the client, right? It's not something that we're just going to, set them off in a rocket ship and gee, I hope they land in the right place, right? We're with them along the way. And so that advisor trust is really important. So with that, I think we can open things up to questions. And actually, Derek,
if you want to go back one slide for a second, I can touch on this a little bit further as well. And with this study, what we were doing was we were experimentally actually showing people different plan results. So one set of participants were receiving basically Monte Carlo type plan results to try and make this, is least or is most kind of realistic. We did tell people to assume they were reviewing a plan for a neighbor, right? So they were kind of, the neighbor needed help. They were trying to help them go through what had been provided by their financial advisor, make an assessment and try and understand what was going on. And we showed them at different points in time and then asked them things like, how optimistic do you think this person should feel about their retirement? How prepared do they seem to be? Should, how well would they weather a downturn, in the market? Those types of questions. And then one of the things we did was we took them through one time period. And I think one thing that's really not appreciated about Monte Carlo is how fast those numbers can change. And so we gave one set of clients was looking at a Monte Carlo result, one was looking at a guardrails result. Now the guardrails participants were much more aware that adjustment could be possible, that it would need to happen. But what happened when we simulated basically a market downturn, kind of a standard type of downturn, and ran actual numbers. So what would happen to the probability of success if you're running a Monte Carlo plan? What would happen in terms of adjustments if you're using a guardrails plan? And then the client saw, or the participant reviewing the neighbor's results saw those updated plans, and a lot of people were, we didn't necessarily measure it this way, but I think they were really kind of shocked, right, by the difference with the Monte Carlo plan. The plan looked, there was no indication a downward adjustment was even something to think about. It started out with a high probability of success. Actually, we ran multiple scenarios, but one of the scenarios did start out with a high probability of success, fell to kind of a 50% probability of success. And that actually deteriorated kind of the advisor trust, right? That people reported seeing the professional as less competent, less trustworthy because of that change. And I think, getting back to not only communicating all this because it's the right thing to do for clients and helping them and just helping them understand, but realize that there's also our own reputation kind of on the line in terms of when we're giving that advice to a client. And if they don't understand it and then reality turns out differently, that could shake their confidence and their trust in us as an advisor. And I think that is kind of an important insight from this research. And we can hop into the questions, but one other general note that I think, when I first started working with Income Lab, and Justin and Johnny reached out to me, I was really blown away and impressed by the technical kind of side of Income Lab and what it can do, modeling all sorts of different types of things and just the power behind it. So that's kind of what really drew me in, where I think I've been surprised in how my own thinking and my own work with clients has changed so much since getting started, is really on the communication side. That wasn't necessarily something that I anticipated, but in having these conversations, thinking about how things are presented to clients, and then just having the actual ability to communicate about these long-term income experience. That's something that when I'm using standard Monte Carlo tool, right, I can't talk about what those outcomes would actually be. Now I can actually guide my clients through a conversation about, are these the right guardrails? And I still am doing my plan presentations to clients where I kind of show results both ways, particularly for clients that maybe I originally did a Monte Carlo plan and now I'm trying to shift them over to a guardrails kind of mindset. And the result has always been, we like the guardrails way much more. That's always been the feedback I get from my clients. And I do think it's for the reasons Justin touched on, and particularly just that peace of mind of knowing how far does the market need to fall, right, before somebody needs to make an adjustment. And then what would that adjustment be, right? I mean, when you're running a Monte Carlo type plan, that's just all unknown. It's not stated anywhere. It's not something that's brought forward. With guardrails, people get peace of mind. And a lot of times it's, oh, okay, particularly if it's somebody who's well prepared for retirement, it might be their portfolio needs to fall 30 or 40% before they would need to make an adjustment. And then even then, the adjustment is so tiny. And a lot of times what I'm finding is that people could actually take more spending than they even want to or are taking. And so, if I'm saying, okay, it says you can spend $6,500 a month, you're only spending $4,000 a month, we can bump that up. But even under this bad case scenario where the market falls, it might be calling to cut your spending down to say $6,000 a month or $5,500 a month, which is still higher than you're actually spending right now. So just having that conversation, I've had, it's been a really big shift in how I'm communicating with clients. I'd say the response has been very positive.
For sharing that, Derek. Perfect. So we have a few questions, but anyone on the webinar, this is the time to start putting your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll start getting some answers out. So Justin, Derek, first one here is, based on a client's planning data, is there a way to start a client at the higher income level of the guardrails? So for example, we would recommend, X monthly income, but the client wants to know, what's the most they could take without breaking the plan immediately.
Yeah, there is. And it sounds like the person asking the question would know that would make a downward adjustment pretty likely if you're starting income very close to what the guardrail is. So you can go to the advanced settings for a plan, and in the income, in fact, I think I have a plan open here. Let me see if I can get an example for you. But you can set the income target to be very high. So, Derek was talking about guardrails and total risk guardrails. So take everything into account for this household, their Social Security timing, their investments, just everything. And the guardrails are based on holistic risk, right? So what's the chance that this plan will need to be adjusted downward in the future? And typically we don't wait until that chance is 100%, right? We would wait until the estimated risk is, maybe it's 60 or 70 or 80. But okay, well, it's enough now that I have high confidence that an adjustment is worthwhile. So you can go and set the adjustment or set the target to be very high. The outcome of that plan will definitely be where there are many more downward adjustments than a lot of people would want. But you go into the advanced settings, income settings, and right here, so my income decrease is at 75. I could, Zoom is making my computer very slow right now, but I could put this target up at 60 or 70 or something, and that would work.
And next question is, what's the best way to convey the income adjustment plan section to a client?
Derek, you might.
Yeah, I'll jump in. The way I'm typically having this conversation, and it can depend whether I'm working with somebody in retirement who's already basically working on the guardrail strategy, or if I'm running it for somebody who's pre-retirement. Then I might be framing, are we talking about what they're spending at retirement versus now? But I like to keep it pretty simple and just talk through basically what you see here. So I talk about somebody, that we're setting some guardrails based on their current portfolio balance of 2.2 million in this example. That would indicate they could spend about 13,700 after taxes. Just personally for me, that's the number I tend to key in on, is the after-tax number, and communicate that. And then communicate, the portfolio. What the results are showing here is if the portfolio goes up to 2.3 million, they could take about another $700 in income. And if it fell to 1.75 million, then they would need to cut back about $700. And one thing I do also like to usually point out is the kind of asymmetry here. A lot of times that adjustment is coming here and only another 100,000 growth, get that full $700 increase versus more sizable decline to get the $700 decrease. But that's kind of how I'm communicating, and often I am kind of rounding some of these numbers, just giving them nice and clean kind of guardrails to be shooting for. But that's how I'm walking somebody through this.
Thanks, Eric. Justin, did you have anything to add to that as well?
I was just going to say that asymmetry is really important. And that's by design. So this plan was just built to have that asymmetry, to try to match a typical household's risk aversion. If you had someone who really wanted it to be more 50-50 chance that, kind of shoot in between the uprights, then you could build a plan like that.
Next question is, this approach is clearly easier to get clients to understand. You spend dollars and not percents. That being said, how can we use this to show the impact of changing their savings rate? Seems like this is where clients need a nudge.
That pretty clearly comes out when you run different scenarios with different savings rate assumptions there. That's something I am using, even with pre-retirees. I like guardrails even for pre-retirees, and more than I think probability of success. I'm talking like accumulators, younger, not people who are just right before retirement. I always found that I wasn't doing much for Monte Carlo for them, unless it's just like a very basic, simple kind of, long-term projection. But, actually being able to communicate more, where their standard of living would be compared to where it is now, where they want it to be. It's still a long-term projection in terms of, you got the accumulation and the decumulation phase in there. So I still place less weight on it relative to working with retirees. But I find that it's useful. You can go in, adjust the savings assumption. Now you're going to see at retirement what that proposed income level would be, and talk about the impact there.
Derek, this one's specifically for you as well. How do you determine how to set the guardrails with Income Lab? This advisor is used to talking with clients about the Guyton Klinger portfolio-based guardrails, but they have no experience talking about the Income Lab type of guardrails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there definitely is a difference. When you think about these total risk-based guardrails versus a distribution rate-driven guardrail, it will be a little bit of a mental shift. But I think, if you were still presenting previously the Guyton Klinger guardrails to clients in dollar terms, it actually doesn't have to be that different. I think a lot of times we as advisors get more caught up about what's going on behind the scenes to getting to those numbers. Most of the time when I'm talking to clients, I'm not getting into any of the details on how these guardrails are set, the different risk levels, any of that. I'm just talking in terms of dollars and what would need to happen, what would cause a spending increase or decrease. And it might be I were trying to transition from, say, a Guyton cleaner guardrail approach to that, that might be a good first step, is even starting to just change that communication, how you're talking about the Guyton cleaner guardrails. And then, you kind of naturally just shift over into total risk-based guardrails approach. You can, and you certainly still could use some of the other rules, like things like skipping an inflation adjustment when a year one portfolio hasn't increased. I mean, you could layer on a rule like that to a system like this, so that's not really problematic in my opinion. The big difference is that now you're actually accounting for Social Security, pension income, all these other sources and taxes, and how that relates in a way that is totally missed. And Justin and I, we wrote about the retirement distribution hatchet and that distribution shape you see, and how that can really bias plan results, and the fact that you don't necessarily want to use that same distribution assumptions going through the whole retirement period. So I think there's very good kind of financial planning reasons to make the shift to total risk-based guardrails, but communication wise, I would think about just kind of trying to keep that as consistent as possible, moving from one framework to the other, and realizing that at the end of the day, for clients, what's behind the scenes probably doesn't matter as much. You might have that engineer client that wants to dig into it, and certainly you can explain it, but at least for most of the clients I'm working with, I'm not getting to that level of depth anyways.
Thanks, Derek. Next question is, would you demonstrate a sample presentation of which reports you typically use and how you'd frame up the discussion with a client? Specifically, how do you compare or contrast the guardrails and probability of success?
So when I'm presenting a plan, I'm often approaching it from a very educational kind of perspective. And again, it's kind of different depending on if it's a client I've done a probability of success plan for versus one that I haven't. But when I'm kind of setting that up to explain, from really an education standpoint, the Monte Carlo is the kind of the dominant methodology, or at least the most financial. If you walked into a random financial advisor's office, that's most likely the type of plan you would get. Here's what it's saying. Here's why. I kind of just give an overview of the history and a little bit, again, educational, and how it was an improvement certainly over just a straight line kind of calculation. But personally, I'm a big fan of guardrails, and then shift to some of the benefits of those. And a lot of times at least the typical clients I'm running plans for, they tend to not be stretching their budget as much. And so a lot of times the Monte Carlo result is like 100% probability of success with $5 million left at the end of the plan. And I just kind of make the point, that doesn't really tell you what to expect or how to adjust or how to stay on course. And it's surprising to me how many times I was just meeting with a physician last week, going over an initial plan, and he beat me to it, and he said, "Oh yeah, this is a very static type of plan. It doesn't really tell you much in terms of what." And it was kind of funny because he was taking the words from me. I hadn't even gotten there yet, but it was clicking for him. But it's not. I'm not like trying to bash Monte Carlo when I'm presenting that, but he could see the limitations. And then when we moved to guardrails, he said, "Yes, I like this much better." And so that's kind of how I'm setting those up. And I don't even know if that's the right thing to do. I mean, maybe I should just skip and go straight into the guardrails and not even talk about that. But that's just kind of my educational style of presentation. I kind of like to walk somebody through what's out there, help them understand if they did get a second proposal from another advisor, and what that might look like, why I think there's advantages to the guardrails. So that's kind of why I do both, but I don't even know that that's the ideal way to do that. And then when I'm working with a client on an ongoing basis and we're working through their guardrails, I'm not even talking about probability of success or Monte Carlo. That's totally gone away. Once we've got the guardrails plan in place, that's where all the focus is.
And I think as far as reports, I know just working with a lot of our advisors during onboarding. Oh, there you go, Justin. I know we have the short-term income plan report, as well as that long-term outlook report seems to be ones, two that we specifically get really good feedback from advisors and clients. Justin, did you have any other reports that you may kind of recommend advisors use as they're maybe trying to have this discussion with a client outside of those two?
Yeah, if you're using PDF reports, these two that I just checked, the short-term income plan is that guardrails income adjustment section plus some other things. Long-term income outlook includes that longer kind of paint the landscape view. Depending on the client, sometimes people will peel back the onion even more, get into more details. So I think this is more rare, but you can use the example scenarios to show, kind of the stair step view, right? Here's an example with stair steps up and stair steps down and so on.
Okay, we got more questions coming in, so I'm going to keep moving. Next question, do you have a way to produce a report for annual guardrail changes?
Let me think. There's not a report module that specifically shows that. It's a good idea, though. We can take that on board. We are working on some things for other displays of plan history, so that would be included in that.
And the next question is, do you have any recommendations on communicating with clients whom have always used Monte Carlo approach? We want to introduce guardrails to them, but could see that they'll question this new approach.
I think for me, that could be a scenario where, again, when I'm talking about presenting both of them, showing them side by side, and talking through the advantages of shifting to the guardrails, because it's not, at the end of the day, still trying to help clients stay on track, but this is it's giving them parameters to actually make some adjustments and helping communicate that. And I think you'll find that once clients see that, there's not going to be any objection. It's, oh, okay, this is a neat, additional piece of information. And how you frame that too, I guess there could be questions about what role is, probability of success previously playing versus now. I've given a lot of initial plan presentations over the past year using that exact process that I've talked about, comparing the two. And not once has somebody yet asked me what's behind the guardrails, what's actually driving that. I know there are clients that will want to dive into that depth, but for me, just talking about the actual consequence of here's what happens if here's when you make that change. And most people seem to be fine going along with that. And I think if we think about examples in other contexts, like if we go to a doctor or something, right? There's all sorts of technical information that my doctor could be conveying to me, but he or she just doesn't, right? It's not the focus of, they're going to tell me what they prescribe, that course of action for me to take. And, there might be some additional discussion, but a lot of times I'm not diving into that. If they tell me I need to apply a bandage and whatever treatment plan it is for a certain injury, I'm going to take their advice and I'm going to do that and trust that there's a reason for why they're giving me that. So I try and keep that in mind too. That again, a lot of times I don't know that clients need that level of detail, but you get that engineering client. Of course, you want to understand what's going on so that you can speak to the specifics.
I've heard that comparison to physicians from some other advisors as well, and I think it's a good one. So, sometimes I've heard sort of some anxiety that clients might think, well, what were we doing before? Was that not good? And I think most people understand that there's an evolution of technology. Same thing would be true for your physician, right? A new drug, a new medical device or something comes along. We don't blame them for not using it 10 years ago when it didn't exist. So, more static Monte Carlo approaches were massive improvements on straight line appreciation or a financial calculator, right? And so this is just another improvement.
And then this question and partially feedback, are there any plans to add a feature to the income adjustment plan for a more visually appealing way to show the guardrails? And so the example here is maybe a picture with an upper and lower guardrail along with a dot for the current portfolio balance in relation to those two.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the plan history
Mhm.
visualizations that we're working on, and that's certainly one of them that we've, I've actually mocked them up before, showing exactly that, your portfolio balance with the guardrails, and you would see over time the balance might be approaching one of the guardrails or the other. Yeah.
And the next question is, what's one area in Income Lab would you share with a prospective client? So I guess if you had to like pick one place in the platform to really highlight for a prospective client, what would you say?
For me personally, it would be the guardrails. It'd be talking about, what putting a plan in place, for the client, helping them understand. And I think Dave Yeski has a good, on the Kitsis Advisor Success podcast, he has a good episode about using guardrails for clients and just the communication impact when so many, he's at the experience where clients tell him, now this makes sense, right? Like now they finally, they've met with other advisors, but they finally feel like they actually have a plan and understand their spending in retirement. I think guardrails are very powerful for that reason. And I think that would be, if I'm only going to focus on one thing with the client, there's that. Now depending on the situation, I know the question was just for one, but a second area that I think is very powerful, depending on what the plan results are, but the tax center for me is a really big area to go in and show something like the value of, Roth conversion strategy. And that's one where I don't pitch it this way or frame it this way, but like I have one experience where it was a situation where the total dollar value was very high. It was something like a $600,000 benefit to using a Roth conversion strategy. And the prospective client said to me, they said, well, that is more, that pays your fee for our lifetime of working with you if we get this one thing right. And that's not necessarily how I'm framing it and trying to position it, but it does help quantify kind of that value of good tax planning, financial planning. And, I think actually helps people understand, why it is that, what advisors do is valuable and how they can actually get some of that value from that. So that is another area, particularly for that prospective client. Again, assuming it, not all cases, there may not be value there, but in cases where it is, that's definitely something to highlight because it's another one I've seen some real impact in terms of clients understanding the value and willingness to go forward with an advisor.
And then Derek, this one's for you as well, but what's your favorite retirement planning analogy to use with clients?
It's probably an area where I'm weak and I probably should use more analogies. I do really like and I don't necessarily present it well, but kind of like the mountain climbing. I think Wade Pfau has one where he's talking about, the descent, right, in a mountain climb is actually a very dangerous part of the process. I don't like to use danger and I don't like to use words like that, but just the fact that, there is new challenges, right, when you're thinking about retirement planning and there's new risks involved. That is one analogy that I do see myself occasionally using. Again, as much as I'm fumbling through it here, I obviously don't do it often. I probably should use more of those analogies, but that's what I like, just the whole kind of guide, somebody, being along with you, kind of a Sherpa type analogy. I like that as well. Just to, assist with that journey, I think is pretty powerful because, again, that's something that even for a do-it-yourselfer who, accumulated a nest egg on their own, there are challenges that come up in retirement, cognitive decline, health decline, other risks that are just very different in reasons why even somebody who, very successfully did accumulate on their own might still want to be working with an advisor who has their best interest at heart.
And then this next question is, so this advisor says, I use asset map / target maps initially. Based on their current lifestyle cost, I work up some basic target maps at low return rates, which shows if they're funded or not. Any questions, any recommendations for moving from the asset map / target maps to Income Lab and how to make that transition?
I can speak to, I do use asset map. I often will use asset map, the target maps, more for like life insurance needs analysis. And so I've never leaned on it as heavily for retirement. So it's not necessarily a transition I've made, but I do, I think you would find it's, pretty natural. Again, just kind of like the evolution of here's a tool that allows us to go a little bit deeper. And I know that's at least from podcasts and other things I've listened to from asset map, it sounds like it's a very popular way that people are using the tool, is that there's the kind of light planning capabilities there. It might give somebody a rough, quick, if you're on a call or something, a first response on how somebody their retirement projections look. But most advisors are moving into more specialized tools for that more in-depth analysis. And I would say that definitely fits the case here, where the target map approach is just basically straight line time value of money type calculation, and you're getting something very, very different with Income Lab. So just explaining kind of the benefits of doing that, showing somebody the guardrails. Again, maybe I'm wrong about this, but in my experience, when I've seen the guardrails almost sell themselves as I explain the value of it, and showing somebody that when they make that adjustment, how big that adjustment is. That just seems to be, Justin had the quote, I think, lowering of the blood pressure, like that really seems to do it a lot, to see what that downward adjustment would be and how far the portfolio would need to fall before they need to do that. It obviously doesn't take away the anxiety in the moment as the market's declining entirely, but at least it helps somebody know ahead of time what action they would take and when they would take that. And I think that's a huge, huge benefit.
And we have 3 minutes left, so I'll give us one last one and we'll wrap it up. And then for our other folks who we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, feel free to email me or our info team, and we'll be sure to answer those via email as well. But yeah, last question here is, so the historical analysis chart seems to indicate that sequence of returns risk may be overblown. Do you agree with this comment? Do you have any additional comments around this question? And kind of the part 2 of that is, would the advisor be able to get a copy of this chart, or can we tell them what software we use to generate it? So I think the second part of that question is, you can get the copy inside Income Lab since it's proprietary to us. And that's the only place you can get this chart. But in regards to kind of this chart indicating that sequence of returns to risk may be overblown, what are your kind of thoughts and comments on that?
So this graph, like Michael said, it's in the application Income Lab. And what's special about this is specific to this plan. So if these folks depend heavily on portfolio withdrawals, the difference between the peaks and valleys, which is one way to look at this as communicating sequence of return risk, will be larger. If they depended almost exclusively on Social Security and inflation-adjusted pensions, it would be a much flatter landscape, right? So you actually would see the difference in sequence of return risk. So I don't know if it's overblown. I guess I'd have to, I think, in the sense that I talked about in this presentation of focusing on the left tail and really pinning the plan to accommodate the worst thing anyone has ever experienced, or the worst thing that is hypothetically possible in a Monte Carlo. I do have issues with that, but I think it's one of the things to consider. And in fact, I think next month we're going to have a webinar on the subtleties around sequence of return risk and how that's really not, withdrawal rates and things are not the only thing to consider when figuring out, is this a good or bad time to retire?
All right, guys. Well, hey, always appreciate the time you guys put into putting up our presentations, getting the discussions together, and then answering the questions. And thank you to all of our users and new folks who joined us today. Please be on the lookout for the webinar recording, as well as the invitations to our upcoming webinars next month. And just folks saying you guys did a really great job. So I want to share that positive feedback with you as well. Outside of that, guys, thank you so much. I will go ahead and stop the recording, and we will see you all on the next one.
All right.